So we're joined today by Christian Körner. Christian received his doctorate in history from the University of Bern and has held positions both there and at the University of Basel. He's also had research stays at CARI, the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute in Nicosia, Cyprus, and has published a number of works on the Cypriot City-Kingdoms. So, Christian, again, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me very much, Andreas.
Just to give a little context here, I took a little excerpt from one of your papers here because I really love the way you started it, and I think it puts things into perspective for listeners. At the end of the 4th century, all of the Cypriot kingdoms vanished during the wars of Alexander's successors, Ptolemy and Antigonus, who struggled for control of the island. Pygmalion, king of Kition, was executed. Praxippus of Lapethos, Stasichus of Marion were arrested. On Ptolemy's order, the city of Marion was completely wiped out. And poignantly, the royal family of Paphos came to a really dramatic end. Ptolemy ordered King Nicocles to commit suicide for secretly negotiating with Antigonus, and with Nicocles dead, his wife Axiothea killed herself and their daughters. The king's siblings followed suit, burning down the palace, and by 306 BCE, all Cypriot kingdoms had ceased to exist. So that's sort of our end goal. We're going to get to that part in Cypriot history. But now I want to backtrack. I want to start at the beginning, the 8th century BCE. And I was hoping maybe you can describe the political landscape of Cyprus for us.
Mm-hmm. I can try. Because the problem is we do not have many sources, but at least we can see that Cyprus in these times is confronted with the establishment of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And I think first one must consider the situation of empires in pre-modern times. The center of Assyria lay in what is today, I think, northern Iraq. And in the 9th century BC, the Assyrians started to conquer large parts of the Near Eastern, even as far as Egypt. And in the 8th century, they had already subdued the Levantine coast, which today is Lebanon, Syria, Israel. And at the end of the century, several Cypriot kings submitted themselves to the Assyrian king Sargon II. And now is the question, how could an empire so large control all these regions, especially on its periphery? And I think the problem is that on the periphery, you could not establish garrisons in a larger number. You had problems to take firm control. So you had to find other ways. And I think might be one of the answers on your question. Cyprus was always in these early times on the periphery of large empires, not kingdoms, excuse me. And I think in this time, about 700 BC, when the Cypriot kings submitted themselves to the Assyrian Great King, they were trying to establish for themselves further commercial contacts with the Levantine coast, which already was under Assyrian control. And so by trying to establish treaties with a new power, they were able to retain this very important commercial contacts. For the Assyrian side, on the other side, it was interesting to have perhaps access to the very important copper mines from Cyprus. And it was also very interesting to boast themselves being kings as far as a Western island on their periphery. That's at least what all their inscriptions repeat and repeat again. The Assyrian kingdom reaches in the west from the island of Yadnana, which is Cyprus, to the east, I think, until Dilmun. So it was for one could say, the Assyrian royal ideology, it was important to have Cyprus as kingdom. We can also we have found one stele near Larnaca from the king Sargon II, the Assyrian king Sargon II, which boasts Assyrian rule over Cyprus, but there are not many Assyrian traces found in Cyprus. It does not seem to have had a garrison or a governor from Assyria, but the kingdoms were kept intact. The kings retained their control, but now were paying tribute to the Assyrians, were probably delivering ships in times of war, but otherwise were left completely free in deciding what to do, as long as they came not into conflict with the Assyrian policies.
So how many city kingdoms do we have in Cyprus at this time?
Mm-hmm. In the first Assyrian text, there are mentioned 7 kings, but the number 7 is all a little bit suspicious.
And
Since
sorry, I just want to confirm this. I believe you're referring to the display inscription text.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
and this text is the first such text that refers to the city kingdoms by name, right?
yeah. No, not by
Okay.
name, but there's also only the mentioning of 7 kings, not
All right.
with names, no names of the kingdoms either. So we do not know which kings or which kingdoms these were. And perhaps 7 is also the number. I think the text says Cyprus lies 7 days to the west. So number 7 is a little bit suspicious. We have later 2 inscriptions, one from Esarhaddon and the second Ashurbanipal, which mention 10 kingdoms. And there we have the names of the kings and of the kingdoms. So probably in the 7th century BC, there were about 10 kingdoms on Cyprus, at least 10 kingdoms. Perhaps there were some kingdoms not under Assyrian control, but this seems to me rather improbable. I think the control of the Assyrians must have been over the whole island.
And some of those kingdoms, we can reasonably conclude from the inscriptions. I mean, the similarities in the names. You know, we have King Atmesu, King of Tamesu. We can associate that with Tamasos. Ituandar, King of Papa. It says that makes sense. That would be for Paphos. And these kingdoms, they're about 10 that they mention, but at any given time, this isn't a fixed number. Are they static? Like, do they always stay the same, or are they changing? What sort of factors influence their ability to maintain their hegemony in Cyprus?
Some of these kingdoms later vanish, especially the kingdoms in the center of the island. For example, Tamesu or Tamasos, or Lydia, which is Ledra, today Nicosia. And other kingdoms appear which are not mentioned in the 2 Assyrian lists, especially Kition. Perhaps one of the names on the Assyrian lists, Karti Hadashti, which means new city or new town, could be Kition, but that's not definitely sure. So we could say that, yes, there is some continuity. Several of the kingdoms reappear until the late 4th century, but some kingdoms also vanish, and it seems that the kingdoms which had harbors, which were lying at the coast and were able to establish the commercial contacts with outside the island, were rather successful in keeping their independence, or no, not independence, sorry, rather were just keeping their existence, and others were obviously annexed by the coastal kingdoms.
Yeah, I find that interesting that this is these kingdoms like Idalion and Tamasos that you mentioned. Often these kingdoms are absorbed by stronger ones within Cyprus. So we know that I believe Idalion and Tamasos was absorbed by Kition, and I find that interesting that Cyprus is an island that's really, it's a very precarious balance between these city kingdoms.
And this balance is also the main factor until the late 4th century BC. You have started with the end of the kingdoms. Until then, we have also always this balance of about probably between 7 and 10, maybe sometimes 12 kingdoms, which sometimes collaborate, sometimes fight each other, but seem to have been in an unstable form of balance.
Now, you mentioned in, one of your papers, this one I really enjoyed reading because it's a beautiful summary of this period. But your focus is on suzerainty, which is not a common word that people
Mm-hmm.
come across. It's very clear when reading it, and it's very easy to understand. So I was hoping you can explain to us what suzerainty is and why this was advantageous to both Cypriot kingdoms and the Near Eastern ones.
I have just looked up for a definition of suzerainty, which I found in a handbook by Coogan, which is very helpful. He says suzerainty is a binding agreement between a king or suzerain and a lesser king, the suzerain's vassal. End of quote. I think this might help explain how a large empire like the Assyrian or later the Persian empires were able to take control on the periphery. They left the local traditions, the local governments mainly untouched as long as these petty kings, as we might call them, were accepting the suzerainty of the larger king. Therefore, the Persian king or the Assyrian king are also often called king of kings because they're king over smaller or petty kings. Concept probably was first established by treaties. We have several treaties of Assyrian rulers with petty kings, or I think earlier also Hittite rulers. And by the way, also the covenant in the Bible is modeled on such a treaty or a suzerainty treaty. Unfortunately, we do not have any treaties concerning Cypriot petty kings with Assyrian rulers, but nevertheless, they must have existed, I think. And in these treaties, there were obviously regulated all the duties of the petty kings, like supplying ships or the tributes. And perhaps in the beginning, the treaties also had to be re-established once one of the kings, one of the partners of the treaty had died. The importance of these treaties for the Assyrian side was that they were able to have a very easy control over the periphery, and on the other side, the importance for the Cypriot side or for the periphery, be it in Cyprus, be it in other parts of the empire, was that the petty kings were able to establish firm contacts and retain the important economic contacts with the rest of the empire. So it was a win-win situation for both sides, I think. And this might also help to explain why sometimes the relationship could get into trouble. Once one of the petty kings did something that was not in the, which came into conflict with the policy of the larger empire of the great king. Sometimes a petty king could try to expand his boundaries and try to follow his own policy, and then he had to be restrained by the greater king.
Which is something that we're not going to talk about it just yet, but it was famously done by Evagrius of Salamis,
exactly.
Both within Cyprus and outside of Cyprus. I know he goes and attacks the Levantine coast, according to the sources, which is very impressive for these, small petty kingdoms with very little political currency in the 4th century. Really fascinating time period. Now, just to be clear, we have suzerainty is Cyprus is on the periphery, so it's far on the outside from the center of Assyrian power, and Cyprus is able to thrive in this agreement because They have access to markets afforded to them by the extensive Assyrian Empire in exchange for relative autonomy, relative freedom. I know they strike their own coins, for example. They have reasonable foreign policy, at least within Cyprus. And they, apart from sending ships and perhaps troops and definitely copper, there's no worry about foreign occupation. And like you said, apart from the stele that was found, and you said in Larnaca, there's not really much evidence that we have of Assyrian occupation of any sort. This is really, Cyprus truly is on the periphery, figuratively and literally.
Yeah, exactly. And this remains for the whole time until the Persian invasion in the late 6th century. In the beginning still of the Persian time, still Cyprus is on the periphery, but at least with the Vagoras, I think we will speak about them later, we can see a certain changement of the center-periphery situation. But for the 8th, 7th, 6th centuries, also 5th centuries, I would say that Cyprus remains on the periphery, seen from the center of the Near Eastern empires.
So if we fast forward then to Persian Empire, Cyprus pops up during the Ionian Revolt, rather. Well, okay, let's start from the beginning. So this rebellion, it proliferates piecemeal throughout Asia Minor's Ionian colonies, quickly spreading across the Mediterranean, and eventually taking root in Cyprus, pitting a coalition of Ionian and Cypriot City-Kingdoms against the vast Achaemenids. And a cursory glance into the origins of the revolt, it suggests that it was a manifestation of underlying ethnic and national conflict. And if it's not explicit, it's implied. I know I've read a lot of books where there's this, we're supposed to see this as a conflict between the Greek elements in Cyprus and the Persian/Phoenician elements. And this, again, and this is very, it's not the right term. It's a very unusual term to apply to this, but it's been seen as a national revolt, and this is a common narrative. But this is problematic. Now, why would you call it problematic?
I think first one has to consider the situation on the island concerning the population. You have, as you have said, a lot of Greek-speaking people, I'd rather say. You have a lot of Phoenician-speaking people. Perhaps you also have a third group, which we might call indigenous. Perhaps these is a population already there before the Greek and Phoenician times. And as you have said, sometimes you still can read that the Phoenicians on Cyprus were the supporters of Persia, while the Greeks resisted in a national uprising. I do not think that this is a very common view anymore in scientific publications, but it still remains in publications for a larger audience. I think the first problem is the term nation. Nations are a very modern feature. I think Eric Hobsbawm has already shown this many years ago, and there existed no Greek or Roman nation in antiquity. Of course, there was a Greek culture with certain common features, but this should not be confused with the modern concept of Greek nation. That is the problem of the identity. We do not know whether these groups in Cyprus identified themselves as Greeks as opposed to Phoenicians, or as Greeks opposed to indigenous Cypriots, or as Greek Cypriots opposed to Phoenician Cypriots, or simply as Salaminians opposed to Kitions. So I think the identity question is just not to be solved as far as our written sources go. Then we have a second problem. There's only one written source providing a report of the Cypriot revolt, and this is Herodotus. And he never speaks of Greeks and Phoenicians in this text. He mentions a conflict inside the ruling dynasty of Salamis, a Greek dynasty, at least as far as the names go. There's one Onesilos. He dethrones his brother Gorgas and then joins the Ionian revolt. Whichever, this is the revolt that had just broken out in Asia Minor against Persian rule.
And sorry, I'm going to jump in here for a quick
Yeah,
second. And this is where I think people would assume that this is some sort of
yeah, yeah,
nationalistic drive, where he sees himself as that this is someone who says, I'm Greek and I'm going to join the Ionians in revolt against my Persian overlords.
yeah. The interesting thing is that his brother Gorgas, also Greek, goes to the Persians, to King Darius, and seeks for help. So we have not only a Greek-Greek conflict, but we have a conflict inside a ruling dynasty, which is Greek, and one of the brothers calls the Ionians for help, and the other calls the Persians for help. So that's also already one of the problems where you see this cannot be something like a Greek national revolt. Then Herodotus continues that all kingdoms except for Amatus support Onesilos. If this is correct, then almost all Cypriots, be they Greeks, be they Phoenicians, revolted against Persia. Amatus was ruled by a Greek dynasty, as far as we can tell from the names, and might have had a mixed Greek indigenous population. So the only supporters of the Persian king were Greek kings with a perhaps mixed population. It is also interesting that Herodotus never mentions Kition, which was the most important Cypriot kingdom ruled by Phoenicians. If his claim is correct that all kingdoms, except for Amatus, joined the revolt, then the Phoenicians of Kition would also not have been on Persia's side. To make things a bit more complicated, we do not know whether Kition was already an independent kingdom by 498 BC when the revolt broke out. In short, whatever the reasons for the revolt, they should not be explained by any national identity, but obviously there seems to have been a large discontent with Persian rule if almost all kingdoms joined the revolt. And I could imagine that Onesilos was trying to play anti-Persian card. Perhaps the taxes were too high, which might be one of the topics of conflict. But nevertheless, we do not see in Herodotus anything of a Greek revolt in Cyprus against the Persians, which is interesting because Herodotus is very interested in exactly these questions. Is there a Greek-Persian conflict at all? Not in Cyprus, but in the Persian Wars and so on. So I think he might have underlined this point if he had found something in Cyprus which would have supported his investigation concerning the Persian Wars. So I think one should not speak about a national revolt, but about a Cypriot revolt against Persia, which shows that there must have been discontentment with Persian rule, at least.
Absolutely. And that was actually my next question. I mean, he he persuades, as far as Herodotus goes, he persuades all the city kingdoms except for Amathus to join in the revolt. So, do we have any guesses as to why and how he was able to persuade all the other city kingdoms to join?
That's one of the most debated topics in Cypriot history, I think. Perhaps Darius had done something with the taxes. In Persia, there was a changement of government, the Cambyses, I think one says in English. Darius might have made a new administration for the Persian Empire, and it might have been that the taxes might have been higher now, but that's only a suggestion or a hypothesis, I'd say. No, we do not have any definite clues why the Cypriots revolted, but at least there must have been a large discontentment. Afterwards, remained loyal until the mid 4th century, shows that later the problems seem not to have been so high. So I don't know.
For Onesilis, obviously we know from the sources his luck does run out. King Stasinor of Curian defects to the Persians. Salaminian war chariots during the battle, they desert, and the Salaminian forces are routed, and Onesilis is slain. One of the most interesting stories I find is what happens to Onesilus's corpse. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to read this excerpt from Herodotus, and he says, "The Amethusians, because Onesilus had laid siege to their town, cut the head off his corpse and took it with them to Amathus, where it was set up over the gates. Here it hung until it became hollow, whereupon a swarm of bees took possession of it and filled it with a honeycomb. On seeing this, the Amethusians consulted the oracle and were commanded to take down the head and bury it, and thenceforth to regard Onesimus as a hero and offer sacrifices to him year by year." Really interesting event, and we can see that comes to a horrible end. Everything is back as is. What would you say? Do you think the city kingdoms, they saw the writings on the wall, so we, as we say, and they said, "Uh-oh, things are not looking good. Let's hey, we're friends again. Everything's all right." Is
Yeah.
that what happened? Is that
Yeah.
what we can reasonably
I think
assume?
so. I think so. It's something which might lie in this concept of suzerainty. You can try if you are now able to shake off your master's yoke, and if you do not succeed, you try to make peace as fast as you can. And so I think Stasanor of Kurion or the Salaminian chariots, which might have been the aristocrats of Salamis, realized that now their future was safer when reconciling with a Persian great king. And it is interesting that we do not hear of any severe measures taken by the Persian great king after the revolt. So it looks as if it was really back to normal. Gorgas becomes reinstated as king of Salamis, and later he is found again at Herodotus when the Persians attack Athens. So he seems to have not only delivered supplied ships, but also to have commanded one of the ships, if I remember correctly. So the Cypriot petty kings now are loyal supporters again of Persia.
So if we fast forward a little bit here, so things are great, everything's back in order, and then we come across a very interesting historical figure, Evagrius of Salamis. Evagrius is king in Salamis, and he traces his descent, his familial descent, to the Teucrids. I suppose the Iliad, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, this is where they claim their descendants from, and we know a lot of him from Isocrates, who
Mm-hmm.
celebrates him as a true Philhellene. So before we get into a lot of his achievements and his exploits, Isocrates, as I said, sees him as a Philhellene. Supposedly, there's a lot of adoption of Greek mores. To what extent has this been overstated, or has it been overstated? Is Evagrius really, this true Philhellene as Isocrates tells us?
I think to understand Socrates' statements, one has to consider the nature of these texts. He writes for a Greek, mainly for an Athenian public. And on one hand, he's interested in questions concerning ideal forms of government, good forms of kingship. And on the other hand, he follows, or might have followed, an agenda of uniting Greek poleis against Persia. And so he might project all these topics on the person of Evagrius, who was fighting at this time the Cypriot War against Persia, who obviously stylized himself as a Greek king in Cyprus, and therefore was an ideal person for Isocrates' statements. Indeed, Evagrius had very good relations to Athens. He even became an Athenian citizen. But his politics, if you take a closer look, are obviously dictated by Salaminian interests and not by Greek interests. He's not trying to fight a Greek war for Greece against Persia, but he's trying to expand his Salaminian territory, his power as king of Salamis. He tries not to be a petty king anymore, one could one might think, but to be a king with a larger sphere of influence. The Cypriot syllabary does not vanish. It only vanishes after the end of the Cypriot kingdoms. Therefore, yes, it might be an effort on the side of Evagrius to modernize his kingdom, or to confirm his good relationships with Greece, but nevertheless he remains a Salaminian king, I think.
Yeah, and we do know that at the outbreak of the Corinthian War between Athens and Sparta, Evagrius allies himself with the Persian-backed Athenian coalition.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can see that, and I don't believe Isocrates mentions this. I mean, for someone who's supposed to be such a great Greek, let's say, that's kind of omitted. And yeah, you did mention he's commemorated, and I believe they erect a statue in Athens of it in his honor, in addition to his citizenship. He's got a really great story. Real or not, I mean, it says that he's exiled from his childhood home in Salamis. And at some point, we have a Phoenician usurper, Abdemon of Tyre. He seizes the Salaminian throne, and according to Isocrates, he reduces the city to barbarism, bringing the whole island to subservience to the great king. And again, there's that thing, brings the island to subservience to the great king. But at the same time, when Evagrius is older, if his policies align with the great king, as they did in the Corinthian War, we're not batting an eye at that.
It's very interesting. When Evagrius comes to the throne, he seizes the throne by force, not by power, by force, and dethrones the unknown Phoenician usurper. That's also already the successor of the Abdemon you mentioned. He dethrones this usurper, which, according to Diodorus, has been friend with a Persian king. So one might have expected that Persia now intervenes, but the Persian great king accepts that Evagrius is now the king of Salamis, and for the next 20 years, we do not hear of any conflicts between Evagrius and the Persian great king. But as you have said, quite the opposite, that Evagrius is in very good terms with the Persian great king. And I think this might have been the reason why Evagrius thought he might be allowed to expand his power in Cyprus, because for 20 years he had been in good terms with the Persian great king. And then he might have been quite surprised by the reaction of Persia once he started this expansion.
Yeah, so that expansion, he lays siege to other city kingdoms, and as you said, we can assume that he thought, hey, if I look how loyal I am, I participated in the Corinthian War, I'm going to do what I want. Is this? I mean, eventually he attacks the Levantine coast as well. So this is, as far as I'm aware, this is the first time we have a Cypriot king, stepping out and attacking places outside of Cyprus. Now, is this a terrible miscalculation, or is this like a very gutsy move? Is this admirable from a political militaristic standpoint, or has he terribly miscalculated?
I think it's already the second phase of the Cypriot War, if you might call it like that. In the first phase, he tries to subdue the whole island, according to the sources, be that as it may be. At least he's expanding his power in Cyprus. And then 3 city kingdoms, Kition, Amatus, and Soloi, apply to the Persian great king for help. And then Evagrius finds himself in a difficult situation, and it is now that he tries to take the war to different regions, like the Levantine coast, like the coast of Asia Minor. He establishes contacts with Egypt, which is already independent from Persia. Perhaps he even had contacts with an Arabian ruler. We do not know exactly. perhaps is also a mistake in the source, but at least we can see that now he's trying to take the conflict into a broader scope. And so this might have been a very bold and brave move to try to win the war.
This is a big concern for Persia because he's really destabilizing Cyprus. At this point, is this something that we can assume the Persian king says, this is not good, we need to step in, we need to stop this, because even though Cyprus was on the periphery, this is not good for business? Is this to use a modern term, is this how we can perceive this?
I think at the time, the three city kingdoms call the Persian king for help. The Persian king does not have many options. He has to help them, because otherwise he would undermine his own power and credibility. So we do not know whether the Persian great king really saw Evagrius' policy as a problem, but once three kingdoms, not only one, called for help, he had to do something. And when we take a closer look at the Cypriot War, as far as we can see, the Persian side is far from being clear in their politics. It's very funny. The first satrap who is dispatched to fight Evagrius is being bribed by Evagrius, and then joins forces with Evagrius.
Right.
So we can see the Persian side does not have a very consequent and united way
policy,
of fighting, policy of fighting this war at the beginning, and it's becoming very complicated for them. And it's very interesting that Evagrius, in the end, even after his defeat, is able to keep his position. But we can talk about that a little bit later. So I think Persia is something in a kind of I would not say crisis, but at least there is not a very firm and consequent reaction.
So what's unique about his rule? So I mean, if we go back to Isocrates, where we mentioned earlier that he's celebrated as a Phil-Hellene, perhaps more a Phil-Athenian, if anything, if we can use that term. Why does he celebrate him? What is it so unique about his rule?
It's a time when generally there's a certain fascination among intellectuals for splendid rulers like Dionysius of Syracuse or Evagrius, and so I think this might be understood in the context of the intellectual discussions in Athens among philosophers about ideal rulers. I also think that Evagrius is a very impressive personality. It's the first petty king and also the last petty king who is able to make such a bold foreign policy, who is obviously able to establish his kingdom as the most powerful kingdom, not only in Cyprus, but in the scope of petty kingdoms, it's one of the most influential petty kingdoms in these early decades of the 4th century. So I think this is a person one had to look at if you were interested in what was going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I'm not so surprised that Isocrates, with his certain sympathy for kingship, had to look at Evagrius. By the way, his texts are written after Evagrius' death, so there might also have been personal relationships between Isocrates and the successors of Evagrius, which might also explain why Isocrates wrote such a great deal about Evagrius.
Yeah, and we also have to keep in mind that his writing is an encomium, which is a these were texts that were written usually in celebration of someone who's passed, and that I think we can be cautious of that. This might skew the way Evagrius is presented.
Of course,
it's very celebratory, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. And the other two speeches by Socrates, there's three Cypriot speeches. One is a fictional speech by the successor of Evagrius to his people, how he explains his way of his kingship. So I think this one has to read this really as rather texts trying to establish a certain perspective on kingship.
For Cyprus, having such little political and military capital, what he achieved, what he did was very impressive. You think about the fact that he was able to leverage his Egyptian support while he's raising Phoenicia, and you mentioned Southern Asia Minor, Cilicia. He causes them to revolt from the king. Even then, when the Persian fleet arrives to Cyprus and he's outnumbered, he manages to take advantage of a surprise attack. He has a strategy of harrying of their supply lines. Ultimately, he's defeated. But even then, you mentioned Artaxerxes' general who forces Cyprus to reinstitute the tribute. Evagrius rejects it. He rejects the ratification of the treaty, and it's again. I'm thinking to myself, who does this guy think he is? How can he say not going to do that? And for some reason, I mean, it gets very, very, very sticky, especially with all these names. But Isocrates eventually says that Artaxerxes agreed to saying as king to king as opposed to as slave to master. And I don't understand how is he able to leverage his position even in defeat?
I think that's Diodorus, not Isocrates, who has this story. Yeah, I think since Evagrius in the end succeeds, he must have obviously have a very correct I don't know the English word, Einschätzung. He must have seen what his possibilities were, and he must have took the opportunity, and he was successful. Therefore, the Persian side obviously was trying to make peace as fast as possible. Perhaps because there were other conflicts. We know that Artaxerxes was fighting in the northern parts of his empire, and obviously Evagrius also was able to see that there were conflicts inside the Persian army between the generals, and he must have taken his opportunity. And I think this shows that he was a very clever politician.
And I think, when we're looking back at it, some of the things that he achieved for Cypriot king is very savvy and very clever, that's for sure. But we also we have to remember and put everything into context when we're thinking of these events as being this Greek rebellion. We always remember that this is Evagrius campaigned against other Phil-Hellenic city-states on Cyprus, and these city-kingdoms, they're always vying for their own independence. They're hardly driven, and again, this is an incorrect term to use. They're not driven by nationalistic or patriotic Hellenic sentiment, but by self-preservation. That's their number one goal.
I think also that Evagrius shows that Cyprus is now becoming more and more a center of interest. He is establishing contacts with all sorts of people. We have talked about Egypt and so on, but he's also able to make contact with the satraps and pulling them on his side, or bribing them, or conspiring against other satraps. So we see one who is very at the center of the action, and one has also the impression that it is Evagrius who's the protagonist of these things. And I don't think that this is a problem of the source, since our main source for these events is Diodorus, who writes a universal history about 300 years later, and is not very interested in Cypriot topics. So if this is the version that Diodorus delivers, I think it might be correct to think that Evagrius really is the one who is pulling the strings.
Now, for all his achievements, Evagrius has a very ignominious end.
Yeah, you could say so. Yeah.
Yeah, very very peculiar end, and I think even the sources are a little confused. Do you mind telling us about how he meets his demise?
The problem is really that the sources are very confused. But it seems that there was some kind um, of affair, sexual affair inside the ruling house, that he and his son were sleeping with the same woman, and that they somehow managed to violating her honor and the honor of her father or something like that. But we do not
Right.
know. But at least he ends in a very, very strange and rather, as you said, ignominious way. He might have been killed then by the father of the one woman he had sex with, or something like that.
Yeah, and I think one of the other historians, I think Theopompus, he says that it was a eunuch who was
Mm-hmm.
secretly arranging these
Mm-hmm.
liaisons with his
Yeah.
master's
Yeah.
daughter for both king and his son, like you mentioned, and then the same eunuch arranged the murder. But Aristotle says something different. He says that the son of Evagrius had taken a eunuch's wife, and then Diodorus claims that Nicocles the eunuch assassinated the king and possessed himself of the royal power over the Salaminians, which is interesting because Evagrius, his son, his name is Nicocles, which probably
Mm-hmm.
is irrelevant, but
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely an interesting story. But this is where we come sort of full circle here. I know there is another revolt that happens later on, but if we come back to where we started the recording, well, we have the War of the Successors. And Alexander, well, we know that again, they see the writing on the wall during Alexander's campaigns, and they clearly they ally themselves. I know that some of the Cypriot kingdoms are a part of the Alexander's attack on the Levantine coast. Most famously, I believe it was the siege of Tyre. We know that they shift, they pivot again. Now they ally themselves with Alexander, but now Alexander has died, and we have the war of his successors. This was brutal series of conflicts. Takes us from the first, the second, third, and fourth,
The Diadoc Wars. Yeah.
and
Okay.
now, if we go back to what you talked about the
Mm-hmm.
periphery and suzerainty,
Mm-hmm.
there's a drastic change. There's a shift by the end of these conflicts. And what exactly happens?
The problem is that what was new about this situation, I think, is that now several contestants were trying to control Cyprus, especially Ptolemy on the one side and Antigonus and his son Demetrius on the other side. And once this conflict started on Cyprus, Cyprus was no longer on the periphery, but had become one of the centers of this conflict. When
And
you
can we
look,
say, sorry to interrupt,
yeah,
can we say that that's a literal, in the literal sense, Cyprus is no longer on the periphery. We're
yeah,
talking geographically,
yeah.
Cyprus is now located in the center. Is that how we can perceive this?
Yes, yes. Most of the Diadoc Wars take place in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Asia Minor, in Greece, in Palestine, but not in the mainland of the ancient Alexander Empire, not in Babylon. It's rather in the Eastern Mediterranean. So Cyprus is literally in the center of the conflict.
Now there's not just one great empire, right? There's several powers competing for hegemony, as you actually write here. There's a mistake, I suppose, that happens because these different kings, they try allying themselves with not Ptolemy but
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Antigonus. What happens there? What happens that's so disastrous for Nicocles?
The problem is that once one of the kings allies himself with Ptolemy or Antigonus, the other kings are now. No, sorry, I have to start again. I think the problem is that Nicocreon of Salamis was the main ally of Ptolemy. And on the other side, Nicocles of Paphos started negotiating secretly with Antigonus, probably in order to see whether he can secure his position.
Mm-hmm.
And once Ptolemy hears of these secret negotiations, he has to abolish the kingdom of Paphos, because what happens here can always happen again, that one of the petty kings can try to ally himself with a other contestant in the War of the Successors. So in the end, it was clear, even if Antigonus had won this conflict, there would have been an abolishment of all the petty kingdoms, because now the situation where, just as in Persian times, the existence of these kingdoms had secured the control of the island for the Persian king, because he could apply a policy of divide and separate, divide et impera. This was not possible anymore, since there were now two outside contestants, and every Cypriot petty king could ally himself with the opponent of one of the two outsiders. So I think I made it a little bit complicated. Sorry.
No, it actually makes a lot of sense. But
Okay.
we know that Ptolemy ultimately, he wins. Cyprus is absorbed into his portion of Alexander's conquests. So why now? Why now abandon the concept of suzerainty? I suppose is my next question. I mean, it seemed to work for the Assyrians. It worked for the Persians. Yes, I know now the center periphery model is different. Can he not still apply the divide and conquer?
No, I do not think so, because once you have established the successors' empires, you have the Seleucid Empire in the Levantine coast and in Syria, and you have the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. Both are fighting for the rule over Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, these regions. And therefore, the conflicts are taking place very close to Cyprus. And Cyprus is important, is of strategic importance for both sides. So it is not possible anymore to let there these 10 or 12 kingdoms, whatever the number was, because there's always the danger that once Ptolemy is in control of most of the island, that one of the kings tries to get into contact with the Seleucids, since he thinks maybe he might have better terms. And then you have a conflict again in Cyprus. So in the perspective of Ptolemy, or if it had been one of the Seleucids, Seleukos, you had to get control over the whole island.
Now, this might be outside of your expertise here, but what sort of and I mean, this is where maybe the archaeology comes into play. What sort of changes are we seeing with this now? This the dawn of the Hellenistic era. What sort of changes are we seeing on Cyprus now that they're firmly established in the Ptolemaic sphere?
This is a very interesting topic. It has been also the topic of many researches, especially by Georgios Pampantoniou, who has written a wonderful book about this period from the late kingdoms, petty kingdoms, to Ptolemaic times. At least you could say that Cyprus becomes a bit more Greek. The syllabary, the Cypriot syllabary, this script which was used for centuries, now very seldom. It's now mainly Greek alphabet inscriptions. Obviously, the language becomes the Greek Koine, which is mainly the Attic Greek. So in this part, you can see that the island becomes more and more Greek, at least. The Phoenician inscriptions do not disappear completely, but also there are less Phoenician inscriptions than before. Sometimes there are bilingual inscriptions, Greek and Phoenician. So obviously it was not forbidden to speak Phoenician, not at all, but there seems to have been something like certain cultural mainstream, and Cyprus becomes part of this mainstream. In the religious, in the religions, we can see a lot of continuity when we look back, which is quite normal since religion is also is always very strong in the tradition. But we also see new types of cults like Serapis, or also the ruler cult from Alexandria. So there are many new influences also to be seen in this area. But it's a very interesting topic, which, if you are interested, you might take a look at Papantonius' interesting work.
Right, and that would make sense. Greek obviously becomes a lingua franca of the entire Mediterranean at that time, and it would make sense that Greek becomes very dominant, and Phoenician obviously disappears eventually. So you said that they did speak a little bit, but eventually it would disappear. Yeah, Christian, I really appreciate your time. This was, I think, a very elucidating conversation.
I really enjoyed it. So if you want to do this again with another topic on Cyprus, just ask. I think it's very interesting, and I really enjoyed it to speak in this also very relaxed manner concerning these very interesting topics. So do not hesitate to contact me again if you want.
All right, Christian.
Thank you very much.